Also, could anyone in chat please let me know whether you guys are able to admit other participants into the meeting or whether it's only me that can admit participants? Okay, thanks for letting me know, everyone. Okay, in that case, I think we'll get started. I'm really sorry if I do sound a bit distracted throughout because I probably will be admitting some people to begin with as well. So just to introduce myself, really lovely to meet everyone. My name is Patricia. I am currently a medical student in my third year at Imperial, and I have been working with Medicat for the past 3 years, helping with interviews as well as UCAT preparation. So today's session will be on the verbal reasoning part of the UCAT. Just to get a brief idea, would you guys mind putting in the chat whether you have already started some UCAT practice or whether, this is the first time you're being introduced to the UCAT, just so that I can gain an idea of basically how much detail to go into? And we'll just wait for a couple more minutes while some people join as well. Okay, fine. So some people are saying that they've already started a bit of revision, as in like reading around it, but not necessarily. Okay, fine. Sounds good. Okay, in that case, we'll get started. It's really good that you have obviously come to this session. Hopefully we'll give you a bit of an insight into what to expect for the verbal reasoning section. So it's quite hard to multitask and let people into the meeting at the same time. Fine. So in that case, we'll get started. So the verbal reasoning will be the first section that you get presented with in your UCAT exam. So UCAT exam is made up of 5 sections. So the first one is always going to be verbal reasoning. Then you'll get decision making, you'll get some quantitative reasoning, abstract reasoning, and then situational judgment. And it's always going to be the same order that they're going to be presented to you in your exam. So to start off with verbal reasoning, let me just rub that out. I'm not entirely sure why that's on there. Sorry, give me a second, guys. Okay, so we'll break the session down into a few parts. So the first thing we'll do is just kind of talk about the overview of the verbal reasoning. And then we'll also jump into a few practice questions and then talk about some things in a little more detail, which I think will be quite valuable for you to know about. I'm trying to monitor the chat and let people in at the same time, so please bear with me a little bit as well. So in terms of the verbal reasoning, the basics. So for this section, you will have 21 minutes to complete it, and there'll be a total of 44 questions. The questions are split into questions of 4. So you'll get 11 pieces of text, and each piece of text is going to be associated with 4 questions. So in total, 44 questions for which you will be getting 21 minutes. Now, that only gives you just under half a minute per question, which is extremely time pressured, especially regarding how much reading you actually have to do for this section. And we'll talk through loads of strategies on how you can help yourself with that, how you can save time, etc. So when it comes to the different question types within this section, you have 2 main question types. The first one is true, false, can't tell questions. And the second one is statement-based questions. And we'll go through both of them, and I'll also give you guys examples of both of them so you can get familiar with them as well. The next thing is the knowledge. So for this section, you don't actually have to have any sort of outside knowledge. Usually the pieces of text that you will get will be something completely random. They might be historical based, they might be science based, etc. You aren't actually required to know anything medical for this section, which some people do think that you do need to know, but don't worry, no medical knowledge is required for this section. In terms of difficulty, this is probably one of the most difficult sections of the UCAT. I personally found it the most difficult, and just according to numbers and looking at previous years, 2 years ago, the average score was 567, which was the lowest scoring section on average throughout the whole UCAT. So people do usually tend to find this one a little bit more tricky than the other sections. But again, there are loads of kind of ways in which you guys can help tackle this difficulty. In terms of why it's important, well, as future doctors, future dentists, but also just medical students and dental students, you have to be using your reading skills and your interpretation skills, etc., throughout your daily life. So it is an important section that they're testing in order to accept you as a medical or dental student. So in terms of like the top tips for this section, how to succeed in it, the first thing you have to be familiar with is a strategy. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two different question types. You have true, false, can't tell, and statement. We'll go through both of them in a bit more detail in a bit. But essentially, each question requires a different strategy. We'll teach you some strategies, but again, everything works differently depending on who you are and how you kind of like how your brain works. So you'll kind of get used to your own strategy with time as well, but we will give you some that we think work for most people and that people have said have worked in the past for them. The next thing is timing. So as I mentioned before, this section is extremely time pressured. I mean, 44 questions in 21 minutes is really, really harsh. And most likely you won't actually have time to finish all of the questions within this section. So it's also really important to learn how to flag the questions and move on and maybe come back to them if you do have any time left over at the end. And we'll speak about that later on as well. The next thing is guessing and flagging, which is what I just mentioned. So essentially, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, you might be, you might not be, but in your UCAT, you have this kind of feature called flagging a question, which is essentially where you can press a button, flag it, and then when you finish answering all the questions within that section, so let's say the verbal reasoning section, it lets you come back to the questions that you'd flagged before. So if you do come across any questions which you think, okay, this will probably take me more than 45 seconds or a minute, I shouldn't waste my time answering it and should probably move on to the next questions to try to get more answered, you can guess that answer, flag it, and then come back to it at the end if you do have any time left over. And that's a really important strategy for you guys to use. Because if you think about it, if you waste 2 minutes answering a question, you could have perhaps answered 4 questions within that time later on. So yeah, guessing and flagging is a very good strategy. The next thing is reflecting. So obviously, as you practice questions, using whatever resources you will be using for your UCAT, make sure that you work out what went wrong in them, write it down, maybe have like a little diary or something, and then just revisit that as regularly as you can. I'm just going to check the chat. I can see there's a few things here. Oh yeah, so someone said, I thought you couldn't go back to old questions. You can. So when you finish a section within the UCAT, you can revisit any sort of flagged questions that you've gone through, and you can also go back. So that's perfectly fine. Fine. And then another point is just speed and understanding. So as I said, very, very time pressured section. And I'll talk through loads of different like tips and tricks that you can use when it comes to speeding up your reading for this section. And I think that's probably going to be one of the most important things that you can be doing for this section here. Someone said where we'll be able to access the recording. I'm not sure. I am recording it. I'll ask Medic sorry, later where you'll be able to record it, and they'll probably send out a message or something. Fine. So what I wanted to do is I put in a practice question here, and I want you guys to have a go at answering this question before we go into any sort of strategies and things like that. So if you can just put in the chat what you think the answer to this question is, and then we'll go through it together. I'm just trying to make it as interactive as possible for you guys so you can learn the most out of it. Good, so I'm seeing loads of answers coming in. Perfect, good. So I think everyone or majority of people have put A, which is true. So let's go through it together. So this is an example of a true, false, can't tell question. So for these ones, one of the best strategies for you guys to use is to actually scan or skim the text in order to answer your questions. So what you want to do is you want to read the question and find some sort of noun or number in the question which you can scan for in the text. So in this case, I'm just going to get my highlighter out. You can either scan for the name although I probably wouldn't recommend that just because the text is about this person, so it's probably going to be mentioned many times throughout the text. So instead, what I would do is I'd either scan for a number or something like million or social media. So as you're scanning through the text, you can see that it's going to be mentioned. Can anyone tell me what paragraph you can see it in? Second paragraph. Really, really good. So in the question, sorry, I'm just admitting people. It says that he has 28 million followers, which is definitely more than 25, and therefore you can select it as true. Really, really good. So now we'll kind of move into it in a bit more detail. So in terms of the question types within the verbal reasoning section, you have two main question types that I mentioned earlier. So the first one is true, false, can't tell. And for these questions, what we recommend is reading, so completely ignoring the text to begin with, just reading the question, determining any sort of keywords, and we'll go through how you can do that later on, and then scanning those keywords in the text in order to find your answer. The next question type is a statement-based question, and these are usually a lot trickier to answer. But for these ones, what we usually recommend is that you read the whole of the text to kind of gain like an understanding of what it's actually talking about, and then read the question and determine where in the text the answer might be located. And we'll obviously have a go at answering these later on together as well. Find your answer and then obviously select it from the options given to you. So when it comes to scanning the question is scanning to read or not to read. So the first thing you want to do is, as I mentioned previously, if it is a true, false, can't tell question, you don't want to read the entire passage. You want to scan for your keyword and then answer your question as fast as possible. And if it is a statement-based question, you probably don't want to scan for any keywords, but you can skim read the passage really quickly to gain an overall understanding of it and then go into answering your question. I'm not sure I mentioned this earlier. However, within your verbal reasoning section of your UCAT, as I said, you'll have 11 pieces of text in total, each one having 4 questions associated with it. Now, usually only 2 pieces of text will be true, false, can't tell questions. And then the other, 9 pieces of text will be statement-based questions. And that can make things a lot more difficult for you because you don't have as many easy questions. However, even if you just get 2 true, false, can't tell passages within the whole of your verbal reasoning section of the UCAT, that will still be equal to 8 marks. And therefore, it's really important that you are able to get those marks easily. So I think what we'll do is we'll just go into a bit more detail on both of these sections. So to start off our true, false, can't tell section, and we'll have a go at practicing some of these questions later on as well. So you want to read the question first and look out for any keywords. We'll do a bit of practice on that later on by what I mean by keywords as well. And then you want to scan for them in the passage. And you want to determine whether the keywords match, contradict, or require more information to answer the question. In order for you to be able to answer false to a question, the statement in the passage has to directly contradict what is being asked in the question. In order for you to answer can't tell, you have to ask yourself, if I was to be given more information, would I be able to answer this question? And I think it's usually between false and can't tell that people often get confused between. So a lot of the time you get a question and you might not actually be able to find the answer in the text. And then people might ask themselves, is this false or is this can't tell? And that's when this comes in really useful. If you ask yourself, if I was to be given more information, would I be able to answer it? If the answer is yes, then that means you would select can't tell. And then obviously, in order for an answer to be true, it has to either be directly stated within the passage or indirectly inferred from the passage. And sometimes this can involve maths. What I mean by this is sometimes you might get a question which asks you, for example, how old someone is, or is it true that this person is X years old? Their actual age might not be given to you in the question, but their date of birth might be, and therefore you might need to work out from that how old they are. Or the question might ask you, how old was this person when they passed away? So again, the actual age might not be given to you in the question, but their date of birth and also the date of death might be given to you, and you might just have to do a little bit of simple maths to work that out. Fine. So let's talk through some examples of like keywords that you would pick out in true, false, can't tell questions. So I have these two sentences over here. So this would be a statement. So you would have a piece of text and the statement would say, globalization is having a greater impact on our environment than ever before. And the answers would be true, false, or can't tell. So obviously for this one, you would want to find a keyword and then scan for it within the passage. Could you guys please put in the chat any keywords that you think you would scan for from this first sentence here, from this first example? Yeah, good. Globalization and environment are definitely the really, really good ones. Perfect. Good. So when it comes to picking keywords and scanning for them, you definitely want to pick words which are unique. So for this first example here, I would definitely pick globalization or environment. And you want to pick out words which won't come up like often in the text. They won't come up again and again and again. And ones which will basically help you focus in on specific areas of the text. Good. And then for the second example here, the Soviet Union sought to use the reunification of Germany in 1990 to push Germany out of NATO. Could you guys put in chat any sort of keywords that you would be scanning for if this was your statement given to you in your question? Yeah, perfect. Amazing. So yeah, as you said, I think proper nouns are really, really good to scan for. So Soviet Union, Germany, NATO are all really good words to scan for. And then obviously dates, I think, are really valuable as well. So 1990. An important thing to keep in mind, however, is if this was the statement and then the answer turned out to be false, then obviously 1990 may not actually be mentioned within the text. So when you are scanning for dates such as 1990, it's important to keep an open mind that the date in the text could be something else like 1995, and therefore the answer could actually be false. So if you do end up scanning for dates, don't necessarily just scan for that one date in particular, but scan for all of the dates that you can see within the text. Perfect. Really good, guys. I'm just going to let a few people in and then we'll move on to the next slide. So this is another example question where now that we know how to scan and we know what kind of words to scan for, I want you guys to have a go at this question. And I've just launched the poll as well for you guys to answer on the poll. So don't worry about putting it in chat, but have a go at answering it on the poll. Can you guys see the poll, by the way? Yep, okay. Fine. I'm not actually seeing any of the results up on the poll unless no one's voted yet. So I'm just going to end the poll, but I can tell really well done to those of you who put can't tell in the chat. That is the correct answer. So if we just look at the text here, it says horses sleep while standing most of the time. So what kind of word would you be scanning for if you were to be answering this question in your exam? You guys can put it in the chat. Yeah, horses, really, really good. And then can anyone tell me where in this text, what paragraph you can see horses in? Good, third paragraph. So I'm just going to get my highlighter up. So it says here, when you're reading it, you will have horses within the third paragraph. And this is the kind of question which I mentioned earlier, where it was differentiating between the can't tell and the false that can be a little bit difficult. So it says, this system enables horses to stay standing with almost no muscular effort, even while asleep. The question says, horses sleep while standing most of the time. We can't actually tell from the text whether that is true or false. The text tells us that horses can sleep while standing up, but it doesn't actually tell us whether this is most of the time. And therefore, for this particular question, we would answer can't tell. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of differentiating when it's false and when it's can't tell. If the text had said This system enables horses to stay standing with almost no muscular effort most of the time, then obviously the answer would be true. If the text said this system enables horses to stay standing with almost no muscular, with no muscular effort apart from when they're asleep, then obviously this answer would be false. So it's really important to pay attention to the kind of specific wording that is used within the text, but also the question itself as well. Fine. Let's have a go at another question here. So I'm going to attempt to launch another poll and hopefully it works this time. So I think I've relaunched the poll now. So if you guys can have a go at answering it. Or if you're unable to vote on the poll, feel free to put it in the chat as well. Okay, for some reason I can't actually see the votes on the poll. So if you guys can put it in the chat, that'd be really good. So again, it's a true, false, can't tell question. So we want to be scanning for this one. So I'm seeing a mix of false and can't tell. So again, it's one of the questions where it is a little bit difficult to differentiate between the two. So for this question, it says kings only hired Arabic and Jewish doctors. So obviously we want to pick proper nouns to scan for, in this case, Arabic and Jewish. If we're scanning through the text, we can see that Arabic and Jewish is mentioned within the last paragraph. It says that you have to read the whole sentence as well. You don't just read the little bit where it's mentioned. So it says many Greek texts were translated into Arabic and then into Hebrew. Consequently, Arabs and Jews were renowned for the practice of medicine, and Arabic and Jewish doctors were often employed by kings. So it says that Arabic and Jewish doctors were often employed by kings. Does that mean that they were only Arabic and Jewish doctors that were hired by kings? No. And therefore, good, really good. And therefore, the answer for this one is false. So it's really important to pay attention to wording here. So because it says that Arabic and Jewish doctors were often employed by kings, when the question says that kings only hired an Arabic and Jewish doctors, the answer is false. Because just because they were often employed doesn't mean that they were the only ones employed. Fine, we'll move on to the next question. So it's the same piece of text, but a different question. So if you guys can have a go at answering this one and then pop in your answer into the chat as well. Good. So a lot of people are putting true for this one. So for this one, again, I'd probably be scanning for proper nouns. So origin and Galen would have probably been the best ones to scan for here. And if you read it, you can see that in the first sentence, let me just get the highlighter up. It says that, one second. It says that in the 2nd century, Origen wrote, and therefore we know that Origen was active within the 2nd century. And then later on, we scan for Galen. And can anyone tell me which paragraph you can see Galen in and whether it says 2nd century or not? So it says Galen within the 3rd paragraph. So as you're reading along, you can see that in the 2nd century, Galen synthesized. And therefore, you can conclude using some inference that because both of them were active in the 2nd century, then it is true that both of them were active within the same century. So hopefully that all makes sense. Really good to everyone that answered in the chat. We'll move on to the next question. We've got 2 more from this piece of text because as I mentioned previously, you'll get 4 questions with each piece of text. So this is the next one. So Hippocrates proved that arteries carried blood rather than air. By the way, there's a few questions in chat. I'll be more than happy to answer all of them at the end as well. So a lot of people are putting can't tell for this one. And there are some A's, some B's. Okay, so quite a mix. So for this one, you obviously want to scan for proper nouns. So Hippocrates would be a good one to scan for. And then also blood and air maybe as well, because they're quite unique words that might only be mentioned once or twice within the whole of the text. So for this one, as you're scanning, it does talk about bodily functions and it does talk about arteries and, oh, sorry, my highlighter wasn't up. And it does talk about arteries and blood as well. And that is here within the third paragraph. Now, if you read the full sentence, it says that in the 2nd century, Galen synthesized much of what has been attributed to Hippocrates. To further his understanding of bodily functions, he performed animal and even human dissections and was able to demonstrate that arteries carried blood rather than air. Therefore, the answer for this one is false, because it wasn't actually Hippocrates who found this out, it was Galen. And that's because it says here that he synthesized much of what is actually attributed to Hippocrates. So it's really important to kind of learn the difference between the two as well. So this is why it's important that when you are scanning for particular words in the text, you actually read around it as well in a lot more detail. Because sometimes it's easy to get caught out. For example, I know a lot of you put A for this one as true, and it's a really easy mistake to make because Hippocrates is mentioned really close to that sentence, which is talking about arteries and blood, and therefore it's important to read around it as well. Fine, and then we'll just attempt this last question here from the text as well. So if you guys can pop your answers into the chat, that would be lovely. Good, perfect. Everyone's putting false, which is the correct answer. So again, true, false, can't tell question, you'd be scanning for any sort of keywords. In this case, James II of Argan would probably be quite a good keyword to scan for. And it says here that he died in 1327, which is not the 13th century, it is the 14th century. And people often get caught out with how centuries work within the UCAT exam and the verbal reasoning section per se. So I would just make sure that you familiarize yourself with how the centuries work. Perfect. Really, really good. So we'll move on to the next question, which will basically be statement-based questions. So statement-based questions are a lot more difficult than true, false, can't tell questions. They basically require you to speed read the whole of the text with understanding first in a majority of cases, and then go on to answering your questions. Now, there are a few things that you can do in statement-based questions in order to kind of perform better in them. The first thing is being able to limit your sub-vocalization. Do you guys want to tell me in the chat what you think sub-vocalization means? It's okay if you don't. Yeah, good. Reading your head. So essentially, sub-vocalization is that little voice in your head that you have while you're reading. And a lot of us do it, and it is very, very natural and very normal. However, it can slow us down when it comes to trying to read as quickly as possible within our UCAT, just because the rate at which you're able to speak out loud is a lot slower than the rate at which your eyes are able to move across the page when you're reading. Now, I'm sure that a majority of you guys do sub-vocalize whether you notice it or not, but it's definitely something that we can try to eliminate in order to help us read a lot faster within our UCAT exam. There are loads of ways to do this. So some people say that if they put a pen or a pencil between their lips, that helps to limit their sub-vocalization. Again, that's kind of just been backed up by science. Also, chewing gum. Essentially, obviously, you're not allowed to chew gum in your exam, most likely. But just when you're practicing for UCAT, those are like little things that can help you. However, one of the best ways to limit sub-vocalization is to actually track the text with your finger as you read. That's because the rate at which your finger is able to move across the screen is going to be a lot faster than the rate at which the voice in your head is able to say the words out loud to you. It does require a lot of practice. It's not something that you just, try and practice once and succeed in. It does require you to do it again and again. But hopefully over time, if you are kind of aware of it, you will become better at it over time as well. The second thing is backtracking. Can anyone in the chat tell me what they understand by backtracking? Yeah, good. So rereading pieces of text. So often what happens in the UCAT is, or in the verbal reasoning section, is because you get such a massive piece of text, when you're reading it, you can quite easily lose concentration, and maybe you think that you need to basically go back and reread a sentence. Essentially, that will probably be a waste of time in the long run for the verbal reasoning section itself. So it's really important as you're reading not to go back on yourself and reread sentences in the statement-based questions. So for this, what I would recommend is, again, just following the text with your finger, because as your finger is moving across the screen, it will kind of prevent you from reading or rereading any sentences that you've seen before. And the last one is chunking groups of words together. And that's basically just as you're reading, instead of reading words one by one, if you can chunk them into groups of like nouns and verbs, it will become a lot faster for you to read as well. So all these things are things that will take time to develop, and they're literally just all about practice, practice, practice. And I think in general, the whole of the UCAT exam and the verbal reasoning section specifically is all about practice. Fine. So in terms of, again, as I said, practice makes perfect. So for these questions, you have to be able to compromise between your reading speed and also your comprehension. So a lot of the time, you don't have to understand the text fully, but as long as you get a vague idea of what's where, I think that's what's most important for questions like this. So my personal strategy for these questions, for statement-based questions, was to speed read the whole text with as much understanding as I could, making sure that I'm limiting my sub-vocalization, making sure that I'm not backtracking, and making sure that I'm chunking groups of words together, and basically try to build a picture in my head about what is being talked about where. So as I'm reading the text, I'm thinking to myself, okay, the first paragraph is like an introductory paragraph, is talking about X, Y, Z. The second paragraph is about something else. The third paragraph is about something else, etc. So then when I go into answering my questions, I can tell what the question is asking me, and I'll know which paragraph to find it in. And I think that's probably one of the best strategies that you can be using for the statement-based section within your verbal reasoning. The next thing is to be active while you're reading. So this is basically what I just mentioned previously. Make sure that you have some sort of mental structure and you know what each paragraph is talking about, so you can go back to it when you go into answering the questions. And sometimes what might happen is that you might have to actually collect information from loads of different areas of the text to answer your question. And this is why scanning for this one in particular might not be the best idea. So in true, false, can't tell, you have your statement, you scan for a keyword, you find it. Whereas in statement-based questions, if the question says, which of the following is most likely to be true, and you get 4 separate statements, that means that if you were to scan, you would have to scan 4 separate times in order to look at all the 4 different statements. And that can be quite time consuming. And if you think about it, 4 sets of questions for each passage, that is you essentially scanning 16 times on one piece of text. That's why for statement-based questions, we do recommend trying to read it all at the beginning as fast as you can with some understanding, and building that mental structure in your head so you can answer it easier later on. Now, when it comes to statement-based questions, you have 2 question formats within statement-based questions. So the first one is easier. It's a fill in the blank question. So it's phrased something like this. So you get a piece of text and then the question says, Tom wants to visit London because, and you have answer options A, B, C, D. The next one is a bit less specific and a lot more harder. And it's basically very vague. It just says which of the following is true. And you have 4 separate statements from 4 separate areas of the text. And we'll go through examples of each as well. So in terms of statement-based questions, as we mentioned previously, you want to identify that the question is a statement-based question by reading it. You then want to skim read the whole text, making sure that you do it fast by not backtracking, chunking groups of words together, and also limiting your sub-vocalization. And then you want to assess the statement and then answer it. So we'll have a go at answering a question together. So if you guys can have a go at doing this one and then putting your answers into the chat, that would be great. I'm aware that there's quite a few questions in the chat. So what I'll do is at the end, I'm happy to spend 10 minutes taking questions. So if you do have any questions, please hold on to them and we'll answer them at the end. Good, perfect. Well done to everyone who's put B for this answer. So hopefully you had a quick skim read of the text to begin with, and then you knew that they were talking about Broca's area towards the first paragraph, because maybe you've remembered that from skim reading the text at the beginning. And it says here, I'm just going to get the highlighter out. So the question is asking us, Paul Broca found all of the following except, and it says here that Broca, known for discovering Broca's area, the main part of the brain responsible for speech production, noted that humans had larger frontal lobes than those of other animals. And B says that humans have smaller frontal lobes than those of other animals, and therefore we know that that is something that he didn't find because it's the opposite of what is stated in the text. So you could just select it here and move on. You could also look at the other bits and make sure that those were in fact listed within the paragraph, but that could be quite time consuming for you within your UCAT. So I would personally just select it and move on to the next question in this case. So hopefully that all makes sense. We'll move on to the next example. So have a go at this. Again, a statement-based question. Now, this is like the slightly harder type of statement-based question because it says, which of the following is best supported by the text? Or in other case, which of the following is true? So if you were to select keywords and scan for them in the text, it could be very time consuming because you'd have to select a keyword from the first one, scan for it, select a keyword from the second one, scan for it, etc. So it can be very time consuming. That's why what we do recommend is just reading it first, getting a brief understanding of what is where, and then having a go at answering the questions. So someone said, should we read the choices and then the text? Essentially, there's no right or wrong way to do it. What I personally recommend is for true, false, can't tell questions, you want to read the statement, pick out any sort of keywords, and then go on to the text. Whereas for statement-based questions, you probably want to have a read of the text first just to gain an understanding of it. But again, like different things will work for different people, so you'll kind of find your own method with time as well. Good, so I'm just going to wait for a few more replies to this one. Good, so we've got quite a few answers, so majority are C so far. So well done. In this case, C is the correct answer. So in past, stricter law enforcement has harmed younger people. So there is clear evidence of this as the speaker does list visible effects of, increasing policing surrounding cannabis, which backs up the idea that in the past it has indeed caused harm to younger people. So it is a bit more of an inference question here. With regards to the other answer options, A is untrue because correlation does not necessarily equal causation, and this is explained in the second paragraph. So A says that cannabis in teenage years causes depression, high risk of suicide. So it says here that the results suggested that the use of the drug was associated with an increased risk of depression and suicide. However, later on, it says that, as usual in a study based on survey data, the authors noted that a clear line of causation cannot be drawn. And therefore, that kind of says that the first point will be false. B is a little bit subjective. So stricter law enforcement would drive down risks associated with cannabis use. And then, yeah, so I think it's really important for you guys to kind of get into grips with subjective and objective as well. So can anyone in the the chat tell me what objective and what subjective means? Good. So subjective is basically an opinion, whereas objective is quite factual. And a lot of the time, I'm not saying this is like a strict rule, but in your UCAT, sometimes when they do have a subjective statement, i.e. something which is quite opinionated, it's actually more likely to be false compared to something which is objective and quite factual. So in this case, the question is asking us which one of them is true, and the one which is quite an objective, i.e. One that's more of like a factual statement is the one that is true in this case. So yeah, really well done. And that's essentially what this slide here is just talking about very briefly. So subjective cannot be verified by factual or scientific sources. And a good way to look at subjective and objective statements is to look at the kind of words that are used within them. So subjective statements tend to have words such as according to, believed, was said by, or someone thought that. Those all point to like an opinionated statement, whereas objective statements are ones which are unbiased and based on facts. And examples of words used with objective statements are things like known, proved, and calculated. So hopefully that all makes sense. And it's definitely really important for you guys to look out for things like this. Now, when it comes to like these tips and tricks that help greatly within your UCAT, such as looking at subjective and objective statements, looking at qualifiers, etc., they're all very important things for you guys to be aware of. And I know that within an hour, there's no way that I can physically cover all of them. However, if you do want more information on things like subjective, objective statements and qualifiers and all these little tips and tricks that can help you, we have loads of resources out here available to you guys, like our ebook on the UCAT, etc. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end as well. So qualifiers is something that I touched on briefly, but essentially qualifiers are words which are used to words that go within sentences, and you don't want to overlook them within your verbal reasoning section of the UCAT. You have two main types of qualifiers. So you have soft qualifiers and hard qualifiers. So these are some examples. So soft qualifiers are things like could, may, can, sometimes, whereas hard qualifiers are more definitive, like always, never, or none. A rule that doesn't always apply, but it's quite good when you're guessing questions, is that soft qualifiers tend to be true, whereas hard qualifiers tend to be false. Now, this rule doesn't work, 100% of the time. However, as I mentioned previously, the section is quite time pressured. So when you get presented with a really long text that you think you're going to guess, flag, and move on, I really do recommend looking at qualifiers so that you have smart guesses when it comes to answering the questions. Then you can obviously come back to them at the end as well. So soft qualifiers are more likely to be true because they're easier to prove, but difficult to disprove. Whereas hard qualifiers tend to be false, as they're very difficult to prove, but easy to disprove. So what I mean by this is, let's say you have a statement which says that all cats are animals. So that is a very hard qualifier. All is a very hard qualifier. Now, obviously, in this case, it is true, sorry, all cats are animals. But when it comes to hard qualifiers, they are really difficult to prove, but easy to disprove, because you only need one example that goes against it to disprove it, essentially. So yeah, qualifiers, soft and hard, are really important to look at, especially when it comes to guessing questions for flagging them and coming back to them later. So here we have another example question. So if you guys can have a go at answering it and popping your answers in the chat. So someone said, are these the only two types of questions within the verbal reasoning section? So yeah, so true, false, can't tell, and statement-based questions are the only two types of questions within the verbal reasoning section. However, there are loads of types of statement-based questions. So you can have ones which I mentioned earlier. I kind of like fill in the gap. So Jack wants to travel to London because, and then there are 4 different reasons and you select which one is true. You also have statement-based questions that are like, which of the following is true, which of the following is false. Those are a lot more difficult because you have 4 different statements from 4 different areas of the text. You also have statement-based questions which are like, which of the following best describes the aim of the passage, or which of the following best describes the tone of the passage. And we'll talk about a little bit on how to answer those questions a bit later on as well. Good, so I'm just going to wait for a few more answers on this one. So I'm getting a few Ds and a few Bs on this one as well. Good. So the correct answer for this one is D. So well done for everyone who did put D. And we'll go through it together. So hopefully, because it's a statement-based question, you would have preferably read the text before you went on to answering it. And this will obviously just help you gain an understanding of what is where as well. So when it comes to the drug, if you've read the text, you know that the drug is being described within this part of the text here. Now, we can read about it. So it says, Santos and his colleagues have recently identified a small mitochondrial uncoupler named BAM15 that decreases the body fat of mice without affecting food intake and muscle mass or increasing body temperature. Additionally, the molecule decreases insulin resistance and has beneficial effects on oxidative stress and inflammation. So, will this new drug cause obesity? Can't tell, and therefore we can't select that as our true answer. Will this new drug decrease the body fat mass of humans without affecting food intake? So I know a lot of you did select this answer. However, it does says that it decreases the body fat of mice and therefore not humans. So this would be a can't tell and a true false can't tell question, and therefore we wouldn't be able to select it as true in this particular case. The next one says that it works on all cells of the body. But in this case, it talks about mitochondria as being the specific cell. And for the next one, it says, well, kind of by process of elimination, you could actually select it. But if you did want to make sure, it says the new drug has the potential to help with the obesity problem. So you basically have to draw an inference here that because it helped with obesity within mice, it has the potential, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it will cure obesity. And that's why it's a bit different from A. So A is a very definitive statement. So it's a hard qualifier, more likely to be false. Whereas D is, leaves some room for interpretation. It's a soft qualifier. It's more likely to be true and therefore correct in this case. Fine. I'm so sorry, guys, that I'm not able to answer all the questions in the chat, but please hold on to them and I'll be more than happy to answer them in just a couple of minutes towards the end. Fine, really good for everyone who had a go answering the question within the chat. I just wanted to talk briefly about some multiple source questions and what I mean by them. So essentially, multiple source questions are ones which require evidence from more than one area of the text to be answered. And these do tend to be the harder types of questions within your statement-based passages. So they're typical within statement-based questions. And this is how a question like this might be phrased. So it says, which of the following statements can be inferred from the text? And then you get given 4 different statements and you have to go through each one separately. These are a lot more time consuming because, as I mentioned previously, if you were to scan in them, for example, you'd have to look at the statement, scan for words, look at the statement, scan for words, and that can just be extremely time consuming. Hence why, as I mentioned previously, we recommend reading the whole text at the beginning and just making mental notes of what is each paragraph addressing so that when you go on to answering the 4 questions associated with that piece of text, you already know whereabouts you're looking for in order to find your statements. But as always, if you do get a question within your verbal reasoning section, or to be honest, any section of your UCAT, and you do feel like you're struggling remember that you can just guess it, flag it, and move on, and then you'll always be able to come back to it at the end and have a go at answering it properly if you do have any time left over. And just as a pointer, in order for a statement to be true, all aspects of it have to be true. So what I mean by that is if you get a statement which says, for example, that let's say all butterflies are purple and have wings, that's your statement. If in your passage it says that all butterflies have wings, but it doesn't mention anything about them being purple, then the answer for that would be can't tell, because although we know that they all have wings, we can't tell whether they all are or are not purple, and therefore we'd select can't tell. And then obviously if this was a statement-based question and it said which of the following can be inferred from the text, and you got a statement that said all butterflies are purple and have wings, you wouldn't be able to infer that from the text if it didn't state anything about the color of the butterflies, and therefore that would not be able to be your answer for the statement-based question. So hopefully that makes sense. And then briefly, just to touch on some aim, tone, and summary questions. So I spoke about this a little bit towards the beginning, but within your statement-based questions, you can get questions which ask you about the tone, aim, or summary of a question, and we'll go through what these mean. So essentially, they require you to have an understanding of the whole text because they're usually asking about the purpose of the piece of text that you're reading. They're only found within statement-based questions. You can't get an aim, tone, or summary question within your true, false, can't tell section. And essentially, this is what they'll be phrased like. So they'll say, what does this passage aim to show? And then you'll get given 4 answer options and you have to select one. They could ask you, which of the following best describes the tone of the passage? Again, you'll get given 4 answer options and you have to select one. Or they could say, which of the following best describes the purpose of the passage? Now, as you can imagine, these questions were really, really difficult because they do require you to have an understanding of the whole text. There's loads of different ways in which you can attempt to answer them. What I used to do for my UCAT when I was doing these questions is I would actually just go back and reread like the first sentence or the first two sentences, and then also the last couple of sentences. Just because majority of the time, if the author is trying to convey something, or if the author has an aim for the passage, or if the author has a particular tone that they're trying to set with the passage, they'll most likely make this tone really clear at the beginning of the text and also at the end of the text. So that was my personal method when it came to this question, having a little read of the beginning of the text and also a little read of the end of the text and seeing what I can work out from that. And then obviously in terms of summary, usually that might be towards the end as like a little bit of a conclusion. So if you do get asked a question about the summary of a text, I would definitely go back and reread the last couple of sentences because hopefully they will have the answer within them. And just to kind of differentiate between what we mean by aim, tone, and summary. So aim is not the same as the tone of a text. So aim is the purpose of writing a text. So is this text to persuade the reader? Is this text to advertise something? Is it to inform? Is it to narrate? Those are all aims of a text. Summary is basically the content of the passage. So you're taking a broad approach and you're looking at what is this passage trying to convey to me in summary. And then tone is like the author's attitude within the text. So it's the way which the content is presented. So yeah, really important for you guys to know the differences between the three. And also, as I said, keep in mind that sometimes reading the beginning and the end is quite a good way to answer these questions. And just to kind of round everything up before we do I'll do a little Q&A at the end as well, because I appreciate there was loads of questions within the chat, which I haven't had an opportunity to answer. But just to summarize everything, some top tips just to finish up is make sure that you start early. So giving yourself as much time as possible when it comes to preparing for the verbal reasoning section is great. First you get used to some of the basics and the strategies, and then you start practicing questions, and then you start practicing under time pressure. And over time, it will become a lot easier, and you'll also become a lot faster at everything. And when we spoke earlier about things like, limiting your sub-vocalization and limiting backtracking, etc., those are all things which come with practice. So again, really important that you start your revision early. I think, if you're in this webinar, that's great. That means you've already started. So yeah, keep going, keep practicing. The next one is speed is super, super important. So, all the techniques we've touched on, make sure that you use them. They will help you with your speed. And again, 44 questions within 21 minutes is extremely time pressured. So it is very important to be as speedy as possible within this section. Learn when to discard. So this is what I mean by flagging, guessing, and moving on to the next question. I, for example, didn't really love like historical texts. So when I was practicing for my UCAT and I was practicing my verbal reasoning section, if I got a massive piece of text with like 6 paragraphs in it that was all about something historical, personally, I wouldn't be able to read it that quickly because firstly, I didn't really enjoy it, and I would have just found it really difficult. So for those questions, I would have just made very smart guesses and then flagged them and came back to them at the end. So make sure that obviously when you're guessing questions, you try to do it in a smart manner. So this is when you're thinking of your hard and soft qualifiers and things like that. Learn when to scan and when to read. So scanning usually for true, false, can't tell, reading for statement based, but that's not a strict rule. Obviously whatever works for you. Look out for similarities as well. So I think this is quite important. So often the questions may try to trick you by phrasing things in a very similar way, with some minor changes. So make sure that you read around the section of text that you're looking at and isolate any relevant information that might be important to you. And then also objective and subjective statements, which is what we touched on. So objective is something that is quite factual, whereas subjective is something that's quite opinionated. Remember that factual things are more likely to be true and opinionated things are more likely to be false. However, that rule doesn't apply 100% of the time. So don't just go into a UCAT and guess questions based on that. But if you are going to guess, flag and come back to it, then that is quite a smart way of guessing. The next thing is remember to infer. So some of the questions that we've done today are to do with inference. The things won't be directly stated in the text. You might have to read around them, connect different areas of the text together to get your answer. And the next thing is looking out for qualifiers. So I know we touched on hard and soft qualifiers and we spoke about it in quite a bit of detail. So that is quite useful for your verbal reasoning. And the last thing is spend time on your weaknesses. So that goes for any section, but identify what your weak areas are. So for me, particularly, it was to do with the aim, tone, summary questions that I found really difficult, because you really did have to understand the text as a whole, which can be quite tricky in the short amount of time that you do get given. So make sure you identify your weak areas and you really, really focus on them, and that can help your score improve massively over time. So yeah, that was basically it to finish up. And just towards the end, I just want to point you guys towards some resources that can really, really help you when it comes to preparing for your UCAT exams. So on the Medic Hut website, there is a little section that has UCAT written on it. And we have so many resources out there that can help you guys when it comes to preparations for your UCAT. So we have live UCAT courses. So these are online 2-day courses that you can book that talk you through so much in-depth information about what is included within the UCAT. And we also have a video series where you have like loads of mini videos. So if you want to answer UCAT questions at your own pace, you can definitely go onto those. We also offer one-to-one tutoring, which can be quite valuable, especially if you feel like there were sections that you struggled with in particular and you'd like to have someone to help you one-on-one, then definitely do recommend that. We have a UCAT ebook as well. So a lot of the questions from today were taken from that UCAT ebook. So make sure to look at that as well. And then also there's a UCAT calendar or like a UCAT timetable that we have on the website as well that's free that you can download to help you structure your UCAT revision as well. So yeah, thank you so much for turning up today, guys. I'm just gonna stay on here and have a look at the chat and see if I can answer any questions. So I'm just gonna give you guys a couple of minutes to ask any questions, and then I'll be happy to go through them. So someone said, did you find that you generally had time to come back to the questions that you flagged? Honestly, within the verbal reasoning section, probably not that much time. Within other sections, yes, definitely. But I still think it's better to guess some questions than to spend too long answering them and not being able to answer some easier ones later on. So even if you don't manage to come back to them, it's definitely really good just to have a guess of them because that will give you more time for later questions. Can we take notes in the UCAT? So in the UCAT, you're going to be given like a whiteboard. I'm not sure entirely what you mean by your question, but in the UCAT, you'll be given a whiteboard that you can write on. It's particularly useful for like the quantitative reasoning or the decision-making section. I personally didn't write anything during my verbal reasoning section, but could you like expand on your question a little bit more because I'm not sure I understood it 100%. Someone said, should we start revising for the UCAT after our summer mocks? So I personally did. I revised for the UCAT after my summer mocks and during my summer, and I sat it towards the end of August. But it honestly just depends on what you would prefer and when you feel like you'd have the most time. Why do you think people perform worse on this section? Probably because it's extremely time pressured. Again, 44 questions within 21 minutes is really, really difficult to do. And also people don't tend to learn from the mistakes that they make. So I think, learning about all these different strategies is definitely really important, but you also have to reflect on where you went wrong and how you can improve off there. How much work do you think we should be doing on the UCAT this time in the year? Or is starting after exams enough in order to get a competitive score? So I think it depends when you want to sit your UCAT. So I'm pretty sure the UCAT this year is open from July till September. So for me personally, when I sat it, I did a little bit of revision before my mocks. Not really a revision, just more to do with like what you guys are doing right now, just learning about what's included within each section, etc. But it was really during summer that I sat down and, did loads and loads of practice in preparation for my UCAT. So yeah, it just kind of depends when you guys want to sit it. How long do you recommend to spend on one question? Good question. So you get about half a minute per question, but that isn't strict. So you get about 2 minutes on average for the 4 questions within one passage. However, some questions will take you longer, some questions will take you a shorter amount of time. So I wouldn't say there's like a strict number to how long you should spend on one question, but definitely try to spend less time on your true, false, can't tell questions so that you then have more time to spend on your statement-based questions. since the question banks change each year, is it too early now to purchase things like Medify or MedEntry? Um, I wouldn't say so. I mean, the earlier you can start practicing, obviously, the better for you, but also try not to overwork yourself and burn yourself out too early on within the cycle. But if you want to just download it, just to have like a brief overview of what's involved, then definitely do recommend that. I think what would be really good is actually the UCAT ebook. So what's different from the Medic ebook compared to all these question banks is that it actually teaches you how to answer the questions and the strategies behind each questions. So a good idea would actually be to maybe get the ebook now and spend some time revising and learning from the ebook. And then closer to your exams, you can purchase these different kind of question banks and do loads and loads of practice questions. And then someone said, oh, fine. So with regards to the previous question, so would it be beneficial to write ideas down of what the main paragraphs are describing, or is that a waste of time? Personally, I wouldn't. It's just extremely time pressured. Um, there's usually only about 4 or 5 paragraphs within the text, so I think you should maybe mentally remember what each paragraph is talking about, just as like a brief idea. I think writing it down would take too long, and I think it might be a waste of time within your exam. Fine. Are the recordings available for the webinar? Should be. I'm not entirely sure where, but I am recording at the minute, so they should be available. Is it possible to answer every single question? Yes, but it's extremely hard. Do you mean in the verbal reasoning section in particular, or do you mean like in the UCAT overall? Overall. I think definitely for some sections. I mean, you should be answering every question anyways, even if it is a guess. Never leave a question blank, because that is just, you could guess it and you could perhaps get the marks. But yeah, I think in terms of some sections like the situational judgment and the quantitative reasoning, I think it's definitely possible to answer every single question. They're a bit less time pressured. But with the verbal reasoning, it can be a little bit difficult. But again, you just have to be smart about it and which questions you'd be flagging and guessing and moving on. Should we have time left over in the verbal reasoning section to check? Not necessarily. As in, don't expect to have time left over. Majority of the people won't. But the reason I say guess questions is because if you guess it, you're not wasting time on it. You're just moving on to the next one that you can comfortably answer. So you might not necessarily have time to come back to them, but it sometimes is still good to guess questions. Is your UCAT score based on how many questions you get right? Yeah, so the UCAT score is, so for each section you get scored between 300 and 900. The average score is usually about 600 per section. So 5 sections in the UCAT. So you have verbal reasoning, which we went through today, quantitative reasoning, decision making, abstract reasoning, and situational judgment. The first 4 are marked based off of a score between 300 and 900. I'm not entirely sure how they calculate the score because obviously you don't get 900 questions, so it's not like 1 question per mark. But they do have some sort of algorithm in how they calculate the score. But essentially, you get a score between 300 and 900 for the first 4 sections, average usually being 600. And then for the situational judgment, you get scored between a band 1 and a band 4, band 1 being the best and band 4 being the worst. So usually on average, I'd say that if 600 is the average score, you combine that for 4 sections, average in the UCAT is usually around 2,400, 2,500, I'd say. And then an average band is probably a band 2. Yeah. But yeah, essentially the more questions you get correct, the higher your score is going to be, closer to 900. Are you allowed a calculator in the exam for quantitative reasoning? Yes, you are. So in your exam, you're going to have an on-screen calculator for quantitative reasoning. And I'm not sure if you guys have had a talk on quantitative reasoning, but essentially there's like some specific things on the calculator that you can use to help you as well. But it will be an on-screen calculator, so you won't be given an in-person calculator to type on. Is it true that the verbal reasoning texts are factual? Hence, if a statement is in the options that you know is factually wrong, for example, someone's date of birth, you can automatically cancel out the option. So that's a good question. So I'm pretty sure majority of the texts within the verbal reasoning are factual, or that's what they came across to me as I was practicing them and as I've been teaching them over the years. However, it's important not to use outside knowledge within your verbal reasoning section. So even if you get text on, let's say, phones, and you're really techie with phones and stuff, try not to use your outside knowledge, because although I do think most of them are factually true, if you do get given a text that happens to be not factually true, it can really throw you off if you are using outside knowledge. So I'd probably stay away from using outside knowledge and just scan for, dates and proper nouns and things like that. How should I start my UCAT revision? Like, what should I start with? I think the UCAT ebook is great. It talks you through each of the sections in detail. It's hundreds of pages long. It talks you through each of the sections in detail. It talks you about the various different strategies. What we covered in today's session is honestly just like the surface of what is within that UCAT ebook. And then it provides you with loads of practice questions there as well, but also specific practice questions to the different things that it taught you. So it'll talk you through, let's say, qualifiers, soft versus hard qualifiers, and then it'll give you loads of practice questions on those qualifiers as well, so that you can directly put into practice what you've just learned about. So the UCAT ebook, MedicHut UCAT ebook, is honestly great when it comes to starting off your revision and practicing. And then later on, you can obviously go and purchase like a question bank like Medify and do loads of practice questions on there. Is each question worth the same number of marks? Honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how exactly they mark it or give you a mark between 300 and 900. I saw on the internet somewhere ages ago that it's like the questions that more people are likely to get wrong are worth more marks, but I'm not sure how true that is, so don't quote me on that. But I don't think it actually says anywhere on their website, because I have tried to find the answer for that before and I couldn't find it anywhere. What would you recommend we do more generally to develop skills for the UCAT? Is reading articles and summarizing them good? I think definitely reading like non-fiction articles like newspapers and stuff can be quite good, especially when it comes to practicing your speed reading and practicing things like not backtracking and not sub-vocalizing. So yeah, I think that's definitely great. But I think just getting into grips with the strategies now at this point in time is probably really good for you guys, and then doing loads of practice questions after your mocks, or whenever you want to sit the exam, is probably quite a good way to go about it. Can you get better at the verbal reasoning section by doing other things like reading more? 100%, 100%. So I know I said non-verbal things, but you can also just read, non-fiction stuff, but you can also read like just normal books as well, just to get better at speed reading and not losing focus as you're reading. So yeah, definitely. Is there always the same number of questions within verbal reasoning? Yes. So it's always going to be 44 questions within 21 minutes, and it's always going to be 11 pieces of text with 4 questions per piece of text. Medify or MedEntry? I personally use Medify when it came to having like a large question bank. So I'm not actually sure about MedEntry. I can't really comment on it. Where can you find the ebook and how much is it? So I'm not actually sure off the top of my head the price of the ebook, but if you go onto the MedicHut website and you go onto UCAT, you can touch it over here, and it basically shows you like a little section of all the different resources for the UCAT that we offer, and you'll be able to find the ebook there. What significance is there of the UCAT after getting offers in other opportunities at medical school? No significance at all, I don't think so. I think your UCAT is purely just to get you an offer at medical or dental school. But I think once you get in, no one has ever asked me about my UCAT score once I've gone into medical school or anything like that. It's not something that you'd like put onto your LinkedIn or anything like that. But it is super, super important when obviously it comes to applying and getting interview offers from these places. And yeah, I think it should be available to rewatch the recording, but I'm not entirely sure where. I'm really sorry, but I am recording it, so it should be available somewhere. What other resources other than Medify and MedicHut did you use to revise for the UCAT? So I only use MedicHut and Medify for my UCAT. Yeah, and I honestly thought that was enough. I think gaining like a basic understanding using Medicut resources such as the ebook can be very, very good. And then using question banks to further solidify your knowledge. I think having a one-on-one tutor can definitely be valuable if you feel like you do want help in other sections of the UCAT as well. I'm getting quite a few questions about my UCAT score, and I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't remember off the top of my head. But I did score within the top like something percent, but I can't remember the exact number. I think it was like 2,900 and something. But I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. It's been 4 years since I've sat the UCAT. Fine. What would you recommend? Would you recommend you do a mock overall first or target each section individually? It's completely up to you. You can do a mock first before you go into each section, but you probably won't score that high. So obviously don't get like disheartened by it or anything. But it might actually be a good idea to sit a mock to get an understanding of what your baseline is. And then obviously as you practice and get better, it will be good to see that you have improved over time. Okay, I think that's all the questions. Unless there's any other questions in the chat. Any distinguishing things between students who get scores 600 to 700 and 700 to 900? Do you mean in terms of like applying to medical schools or just like distinguishing things as in what those students would do from the other students? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Mock exams do give you a score, yeah. So if you do mock exams on like Medify, you'll get a score from them. Is having a peak a real thing? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is every section valued the same as each other? Yeah, so your overall UCAT score is going to be all of your sections combined and added together, or essentially an average of all your sections. So I guess they're all valued at the same. Like your medical schools, your dental schools won't look and see whether you did particularly well in one section or another. They'll just look at your overall score, which is quite good because even if you don't do that well in one section or you're not quite strong at one section, if you have another section that you're really strong at, your overall score might still be quite good. Is it true that when you practice, you're at your highest performance at a certain point, and if you keep practicing after, your performance will drop? I don't think so. That never happened to me. I've never heard of that actually either. I mean, if you practice, hopefully that means you just keep getting better. So yeah, I'm not sure that is a real thing, like the peak. I'm not sure where you've heard that. But yeah, I mean, I didn't experience it anyways. What are the main distinguishing factors overall for people who get band one and top scores? I think practicing, just doing loads of practice questions, is super important. But also a lot of people just go into the UCAT exam, haven't done practice questions, but not actually understood the strategies that are associated with the questions to begin with. Hence why I keep going on and on about, having something like the Medicut ebook, for example, which will talk to you about the different strategies that you can adopt before you go on to doing these practice questions. And it will just help to solidify your base of knowledge before you begin. People say that there's a peak or that you will do really badly in the days before you sit the exam. I'm not sure. I didn't experience the peak, so I can't really comment on that, I don't think. How early did you start revising for the UCAT? I think I revised for about 6 weeks, I think 6 to 8 weeks. I'm not entirely sure. It was quite a while ago. When would you recommend that we sit the UCAT? It's completely up to you. I sat it at the end of August, towards the end of summer, because I just thought that I'd spend the whole of the summer revising. But yeah, it depends on your other commitments as well, and like what you're doing during the summer, when your mocks are and things like that. Can the verbal reasoning section mess up the rest of the test during the actual exam? So because a lot of people find the verbal reasoning section hard, and because it is one of the first sections within the UCAT, it can throw you off mentally as like a student sitting the UCAT. However, in like the bigger picture of things, if you do slightly worse in your verbal reasoning section, It's not actually going to negatively affect your exam if you do really well in all your other sections, because as I said earlier, it's an average across all the sections that you get that's given to your medical or dental schools. Would you recommend to sit in September or late August? Honestly, completely up to you. I probably wouldn't leave it right to the end. I think the last date of examination is like somewhat towards the end of August, sorry, end of September. So I wouldn't sit right at the end of September, just in case, you know, you're ill on the day and you're not able to reschedule or something like that. Yeah, but it's completely up to you. Depends on your other commitments. So they can't see what you got in your individual sections. I think they can see what you got in your individual sections, but I don't think they look at it. Don't quote me on that per se. I'm obviously not the medical school and I don't do the application processes for them. But overall, when medical schools tell you about their requirements, it's usually like a cutoff that they're looking for, and the cutoff is usually the average of the sections. So personally, I don't think they do look at individual scores, but yeah. Okay. Thank you guys so much. I'm just gonna wait around for like 2 more minutes to see if there's any other questions. Which schools have lower UCAT requirements? Um, I'm not sure off the top of my head. But you can definitely find loads of information online. So you can, if you go onto the different medical schools or dental schools, they will give you kind of like the cutoffs that they're looking for or the cutoffs that they had in previous years. And that can obviously help you guide which medical schools or dental schools you might want to apply for. With Oxbridge, do you think that there will be a much higher competition with the UCAT switch? Who knows? It is the first year that obviously they have gotten rid of the BMAT and switched to the UCAT. So I think it can, yeah, I don't think I can say anything on it. I'm not too sure. Another thing about the UCAT, which I don't think I mentioned, is that everyone sits a different exam, or most people sit different exams. So as opposed to the BMAT, where everyone sat it on the same day and everyone had the same set of questions, the UCAT is a little bit different. Because basically when it comes to the UCAT, they have like a few sets of the UCAT exam that they have. And if you go and you sit it on 10 a.m. on a Monday, you might get a different set of questions than someone who sits at 11 a.m. on a Monday, if that makes sense. So that's the only thing about the UCAT, is that obviously you need to practice loads for it, you need to get better at it, but there is also an element of like luck on the day and like whether you get questions that you like or whether you get questions that you're like good at on the day. Um, do you recommend taking any notes while reading in the verbal reasoning section? No, I wouldn't say so. I think it would be quite a waste of time. It's a very time pressured section. If everyone sits a different exam, then how's it fair to compare performances? They go through like rigorous tests to make sure that they're as similar to each other as possible in terms of difficulty. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure. The exam is about 2 hours. Yeah, 2 hours. It's a really long exam. Any other questions? Okay. I can't see any other questions on chat. In that case, was it hard to find a test center near me? So I sat my UCAT during like the COVID years. So I actually sat at home. So I'm not entirely sure about, finding test centers and things like that. Fine. Thank you so much for everyone for turning up today. I hope that was helpful for you guys. Again, this was literally just like the surface of what is taught within the verbal reasoning and what the verbal reasoning entails. So I do definitely recommend looking into like further resources such as the Medicut ebook. I think that's definitely very, very helpful. But yeah, and I love studying medicine. Someone said it in the chat as well. And just as a final thing, Medicut also has a TikTok. If any of you do have TikTok, it's just at Medicut. And we post quite a few videos there helping you guys and giving you tips and tricks for various different things like the UCAT and then later on the interviews as well. So if you're interested, definitely do check out the Medicut TikTok as well. Cool. Thank you so much, guys, for coming. And all the best with your application processes. Thank you.